Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's session, The Subscription Economy, Mastering the Recurring Revenue Challenge. My name is Julie Donnell, and I'm a business consultant with Thales. I'll be your moderator today as we dive into the topic that's been keeping many of us up at night, how to master the transition to recurring revenue. As we get started, it's my pleasure to introduce today's speakers. Mark Billige is a managing partner for the UK practice of Kucher Partners. He's been with the firm since 2006 and is a chartered management accountant with a BA from the University of Nottingham. Mark has 15 years experience in the field of pricing and financial management, and he's specialized in many areas, including the development of growth strategies, discount optimization, Salesforce management, and negotiation strategy. He consults and advises for numerous private equity firms. Thank you for being with us today, Mark. And Stephan Liozu is the Chief Value Officer at the Thales Group. He's also the founder of Value Interruption Advisors, a consulting boutique specializing in value-based pricing, digital pricing, and industrial pricing. He's the author of 9 pricing books and has published numerous academic articles for the Journal of Revenue and Pricing Management. Stephan, thank you for joining us today as well. Lastly, a few logistics. A recording of the webinar will be available, and you can expect to receive an email with details on how to access the recording. We want to hear from you during this webinar, so feel free to add questions to the Q&A so that we can have this session at the end. So let's get started. I'm going to hand things over to Mark.
Thanks, Julie. Just to check, you can hear me okay, can you?
Yes, thank you, Mark.
Great. Super. So thank you, everybody. Good afternoon from London. Julie said, my name's Mark Billige. I'm a partner with Kucher Partners. Maybe just to start us off, I will just take 1 second to share 1 or 2 points about Kucher Partners, who we are and what we do. I just need to get control of the slides. Okay, here we go. I think we're there now. Right, here we go. So Kucher numbers, maybe 6 quick facts about us. So firstly, we're a global firm, about 1,500 of us around the world. We are 112 partners. About 350 million euro business will be this year. We grow ourselves about 20% every year. Very importantly, in the last few years, well over 3,500 projects on pricing, revenue management, transition to subscription, etc. And seen very clearly as the #1 consultancy worldwide in these topics around marketing, branding, and pricing. So we spend our lives consulting our clients all around their top line growth, how to adapt and transition their pricing models. So here we go. I'm going to talk a little bit about then the very simplistic economics of subscription. Really, I think every subscription business fundamentally has 3 tasks to do. You have to go out and you have to acquire more customers. You then have to monetize those customers somehow. And then at the end of the term, you have to retain them. And I think interestingly in there, we get this running and we get recurring revenue growth. This actually sounds pretty easy. The challenge is not doing any one of those 3 things, but is actually doing all 3 of those things at the same time. And this is where we get this kind of trade-off, or what I call this kind of trade-off triangle. Because actually, to go ahead and acquire customers, well, if we talk about what our acquisition team would look for, or our marketing team, they'd say, right, what I want packages with very little commitment on them. You know, no barriers to entry whatsoever, no long terms, pay as you go, monthly by month. And I also want to make sure we have a lot of value in the entry-level package so we can get people in the door. If I speak to the retention team, they'll say, well, I want something quite different actually, because we need to increase the commitment level. Low commitment doesn't work for us. We need high levels of commitment. So we would like longer terms. We would like more barriers to exit. We'd like to make it slightly more difficult to leave. So we have this trade-off in commitment. The retain team would also talk about saying, hey, listen, let's keep prices where they are. Let's not try and drive monetization too hard because we know that price leads to churn. And the monetization team, be that product management or so, will say, well, actually, we'd quite like to increase prices over time. We also need the ability to upsell people. We can't give them everything on day one. We need to have more left in the tank to sell over time. So you see that we kind of start to build this trade-off within subscription economics. It says we can't do all these things at once. So how do we actually start to balance across the trade-off triangle? Well, we have three levers that we can play with as a business. The first one is our packaging. To say, well, if I get my packaging design right, I can kind of win on both. If I move from having one pack and I actually provide some choice, I might be able to acquire and monetize. And if I put it cleverly, I might be able to cross-sell over time. So thinking a bit about packaging as solving that trade-off. The second one we have then is around our price model. So how do I use different kinds of price model and more nuanced subscription models to balance the risk between me as the supplier and the customer, i.e. not putting all the commitment on them or all the commitment on me? And how do I use the model to get closer to value as well in that equation? And then the third one is around the price itself, which is how do I deal with this problem of trying to have low prices or stable prices to retain, but also increasing price over time? Well, it means I need to be more differentiated and personalized. So looking at more nuanced pricing around the individual subscriber, and then also what do I do at the end of the subscription term, etc. So this is going to be the framework I'm going to use to talk us through for the next 10 or so minutes, 10 or 15 minutes, diving into this packaging, price model, and price level, as thinking through how we can evolve the subscription model to deal with all these trade-offs in one go. So let's start by talking a bit about packaging. Here we go. So start with the example of Netflix, I suppose the poster business for subscriptions. And their subscription has evolved actually over time. And back in 2011, when they did the first thing, they split the DVD business from the streaming business, and the streaming business as we know it now. And they actually started off with a very, very simple offer. It was Netflix is $7.99 and that's it. And in that you had unlimited streaming with multiple titles across, you've got 2 devices you could stream to. And I guess at some point they decided, hey, we're now living with that trade-off we didn't like, which is at $7.99, it's probably actually very good value for heavy users and people that are using this a lot. But if we push the price up too early, maybe we slow down our conversion. So they didn't like the trade-off. So what did they do? Well, of course, they came up with 2 packs. They said, let's keep the $7.99 and let's create an $11.99 product with, and in this case, they use screens as the differentiator to say more screens, more value, higher price. And then not too long after that, that was in April 2013, and then 6 or so months later, they realized actually 2's less good than 3, and actually let's take those 2, but now let's introduce something at the bottom end to drive the acquisition more. So they ended up with this kind of very classic 3-tier lineup. They didn't go there straight away. They started simple and they evolved over time. But in essence, this is how they decided to beat the trade-off triangle by saying, hey, listen, we want to monetize. So we have our $11.99 pack. We have a nice, clear upsell path so you can pay us more money over time. But we also want to acquire. So we come up with this kind of fighter product, as it were, super sharp price point, $6.99, but only 1 screen. And there is no mistaking that there's a lot of science behind this. These are not randomly picked numbers. The fact that it's only $1 more to get double the value is that kind of upsell and monetization path over time. So here's an example of how business starts simple, but when they start to encounter that trade-off, they introduce a degree more complexity in their packaging to solve the issue of acquiring and monetizing in parallel. I'm going to talk a bit more about packaging now, and maybe a picture you potentially didn't expect to see in a webinar about subscription models, a Panini sticker album. And I always use this because when it comes to packaging, packaging is as much about the psychology and the framework we give our customers as it is about the actual contents of the package and the price points itself. Because I imagine if you're a bit like me and you're looking at this screen now, you're thinking there's something I want to do. And what I want to do is I want to fill in the gaps. And this is a really simple framework and a very simple packaging framework that any customer can work with, which is to say you complete a system and you get this very nice, warm, fuzzy feeling that you filled in the gaps. And so we've been using that, for instance, with our clients in the financial services industry to say, well, listen, let's think about taking Panini into the packaging of financial services products. This is a German bank, but what you're actually seeing is you're seeing the screen that the branch banking manager uses, and then you also have this in your private banking in the web app that says, hey, you know what? You have the current account, you have the savings account, maybe you have an insurance product or a mortgage, but what about the ISA? What about the long-term savings plan? What about the children's ISA? So we create the system that allows people to kind of fill in the blanks. And what we see when we test this as a packaging method is we see that when you present things in this way versus presenting just 5 or 6 products in a lineup, we get 3 times the cross-sell effect by basically creating a very simple framework that customers can solve themselves. So on packaging then, the story is we start simple, we evolve over time, and actually smart packaging allows you to really use customer psychology and simple frameworks to allow this kind of cross-sell and upsell to rather naturally happen within the customer base. So much about packaging. The second trade-off we talked about was this commitment balance. How do I have a model that allows me to, on the one hand, acquire easily, so very low commitment, very low risk for the customer, but actually in subscription world, retention really matters as a KPI. How do I keep customers at the end of the term, and how do I balance that? And so if we think about very, very kind of classic and simple kind of subscription world, we kind of think in 2 dimensions. We think subscription is about some kind of fixed term. So it used to be that we sold things on a transaction basis, pure pay as you go. If you want to have 1 go, you pay me £10, 2 goes, £20. And then someone said, actually, you know what? We want a recurring revenue model. So that says we need some kind of fixed dimension, which says it doesn't matter how many goes you have, you pay me £100 a year or so. And of course, the very natural tension in this is that subscription model we just talked about is a horrible model for acquiring customers on, because they say, now I have to take all the risk that I start this thing and I get value out of it. I would actually much rather pay as you go. And which is why we have businesses like gyms. And I don't know, I imagine many of you are members of a gym, and like me, you might not go to the gym as much as you thought you would. And so interestingly, gyms as a subscription product started to go the other way. They used to be 12, 24-month contracts. They've actually become much more pay-as-you-go like in their structure, because they had this problem of saying the subscription is super for retention. It's really, really bad for customer satisfaction and acquisition, because people don't want to sign up for a long time. You also have the opposite problem, which is you have businesses that say, you know what, we love the idea of recurring revenue, but we're super transactional. I'll give you an example of American Airlines. Some years ago, a decade or 2 ago, they launched their own subscription. The 100, I think it was, I forget the numbers, say $250,000 all-you-can-fly first-class ticket, the ultimate flat-rate subscription. Of course, the problem with this was the only people that pick that are very frequent flyers. And when they did the math, they found out they lost about $1 million per year on every single one of them. So they had to go and cancel that, with obviously huge backlash and massively tarnished customer sentiment. So the balance between these 2 extremes is very hard to get. So the obvious answer is to say, well, is there anything in between the 2 that gives me some of the kind of the feeling of a subscription model, but actually not all the kind of the risk? And so I use the example here of a very different business, truck tires. One of our clients, Michelin, and they had this problem that they'd come up with this super tire, and the tire lasts twice as long. And then selling tires, and this becomes difficult, because you either have to charge twice as much for the tire to get the same revenue, or you have to somehow encourage people to stay with you twice as long. So, and the problem they had is that no one, even if you tell them the tire will last twice as long, will pay you twice as much for a truck tire. It simply doesn't work. So having tried really hard to solve that trade-off with the price level, we thought about it differently and said, you know what, this classic model of buy the tire, why do we have to stick with that? Why not think about something different, more subscription-like, more recurring? So we came up with the concept of price per kilometer. Said, you know what, no one actually wants to buy tires. Tires are just a means to an end. What people want is they want trucks that move. They want to keep the truck rolling. So they actually don't want the product, they want the service. So by flipping the model on its head and saying, now you pay per kilometer the tire has run, we do a couple of clever things, which is we massively reduce that entry barrier problem we had, which is double the price of the tire, because actually there's no risk now. We take all the risk now onto ourselves. You take no risk. You don't drive, you don't pay. This works technologically because in this end of the business, you have to kind of record the miles your trucks drive. So there's a little bit of sharing and transparency. And then it also works brilliantly because it says, you know what, dear Mr. Customer, if you're not making money, i.e. you're not pushing freight around the country, then you don't pay us. So now our cost to you aligns with your revenue basis. And we can start to subscriptionize this and say, pay for your first 1,000 kilometers, whatever that looks like. The concept being here, thinking really cleverly about the model, not the price point, but the model allows us to kind of break that trade-off problem of acquiring and monetizing all at the same time. So a little bit about the price model. The third lever I talked about then is the price point itself. So back to that thinking of the retention team say, I want to keep prices low and stable. For monetization, we need to push price up over time, and this becomes a very important part of our subscription economics. So how do we deal with that? Maybe just to kind of share one or two thoughts on this. So the first thing is, fundamentally in this, we need to pick a pricing strategy. It's very, very hard to be all things to all people. I'm going to use two examples here, two businesses we all know very well. So both trillion-dollar companies. So the one is Apple, the other is Amazon. Now, what's interesting for both, and that's what I find fascinating, is both are supremely successful, but both have polar opposite different pricing strategies. For Apple, their North Star metric, as it were, is the monetize. It's about profitability. They have no interest in being the company that sells the most mobile phone handsets. They would like to be the company that takes the most profit out of the market. So they're happy to have a 20 to 25% volume share if they have the 80% plus profit share that they have of the smartphone market. Amazon are different. Their KPI is very clear, it's market share. They say, you know what, we like acquire and retain more, and we're willing to give up some monetization to do that. So their North Star is all about volume and share, and they say we want to own the customer, we want to own the share of wallet. Which means, therefore, their pricing strategy also has to fit that way. Apple say, in this case, we have a premium pricing strategy. It's very simple. We don't lower prices, we keep prices high, we introduce higher price models. Amazon are different. They say we penetrate. We don't skim, we go low, and we keep margins low, and we drive volume through penetration. I think this is summed up beautifully in quotes from the two founders. So Jobs on the one hand said, our belief was that if we kept putting great products in front of customers, they continue to open their wallets. Entire focus on monetization. Amazon, of course, say, hey, we're different. We're going to be the kind of retailer that works out how to charge more. We think there's two kinds of retailers, folks who work out how to charge more and companies that work out how to charge less. And we're always going to be the second. So first things first, we have to pick a strategy, decide where to be. The second bit then is how do we start to say, hey, you know what? We want to have, yeah, we want to monetize, but we also don't want to kill acquisition. And yes, we want to drive acquisition. We don't want to kill monetization. It means that we have to think about pricing as a science, not just as an art form. I use an example here from a SaaS client of ours. And before we started working with them, we took a look at some very simple data, and this is what we saw. They sold 3 products, so we already gave them a tick for that. Well done, we like 3 with the Netflix example. But as we looked at, I saw a few things I looked at. The first thing I saw was, hey, we clearly have too many customers buying your basic product. Nearly 60% of the base on basic says, either that's too cheap or there's just simply too much value in there and we're not upselling people through the stack. The second one I looked at and said, you know what, $79 for standard. That to me is a no man land price. This isn't what we call a so-called charm price. Anyone's going to pay you 79 would probably pay you 99. So we feel this kind of, we're missing some monetization opportunity on the 79. So what we did was we set about just thinking about this a little bit differently. And we did the following. We actually kept the basic product exactly as it was. What we did though, at $49, we took some elements out of that and we pushed them up into standard. At the same time, we pushed the price of standard up to $99. The 149 in advance, we stretched that relationship a little bit, so we get that nice kind of, you know, $50 up to 99, then 100 step up, so we stretch it. And then we also came up with this really interesting premium tier at the very top, $299. Now, we actually designed that not expecting really anybody to buy it. Very kindly, 2% of the market went for it. The concept here being that, you know what, if I have something at $299, that certainly makes the $99 standard product look like very good value for money. So this is that kind of, not exactly panini, but a psychology of the pricing and the packaging that actually says, you know what, we'll introduce a product, we don't really necessarily want to sell that, but it creates much more high perception of value in the other elements of the product portfolio we want to sell. So my point being that if we really think about these price points carefully, we can kind of have a little bit of it all. And what we saw here was, you know, in subscription terms, pretty good impact, I would say. 36% uplift in ARPU from new subscribers. That is, you know, ultimately the product they pick. And then the MRR, so the monthly recurring revenue, increasing by almost 30% as well. So key point being that this trade-off in pricing requires you to think very scientifically. It's not enough just to kind of pick prices out at random. We have to think about these kind of charm price points. We have to think about the structure of our whole pricing menu. So, quick summary then, the last 2 minutes, before I hand over to Stephan. We see that subscription pricing is very easy in theory. We have to acquire, we have to monetize, and we have to retain. It becomes complicated in reality because there's inherent trade-off in doing those three things. This means we have to become slightly smarter in our packaging. We have to introduce an element of choice, but keep it simple to allow us to cross-sell and upsell to do both. We have to think about new price models that balance the risk, i.e. we don't ask for everything up front necessarily, but we also don't have the full flat rate, that we have these kind of hybrids that allow us to monetize over time. And finally, we have to think about our price level a bit more scientifically, either making it more personal, more differentiated, and more scientific over time. So that would be my summary. It was lovely speaking to all. I'm staying on. After Stephan, we're going to have time for some questions. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Stephan.
Great. Nice to follow the expert. Thank you, Mark. So, you know, obviously, there is a lot of knowledge and there are best practices in the B2C world and in the you know, the SaaS world, and it's phenomenal to see how, you know, subscriptions and recurring business models in general have penetrated lots of industries in the B2C side. You know, today, you know, my portion of my of the presentation will be more on the okay, now you're an industrial company and or you're a manufacturer, and you see this tsunami coming from you know, it started a while back, but today you see what's happening in some industries that have actually used subscription and recurring business model as an opportunity for tremendous growth. And you're looking at you know, the media, the entertainment, the streaming, you know, music, you name it. It's booming. It's booming, and some of these newspapers, for example, have been reborn through subscription. So now, fast forward to today, where, you know, the B2B world is starting to really pay attention, and even outside the SaaS world, you know, pretty much 70 to 75% of the software world is as a service, if you look at the statistics. But what could be happening in the world of automotive, construction, materials, chemical, aerospace, and eventually going into the business to government world? So that tsunami is not done, right? But it is, I would say it is different to do subscription modeling in industrial areas versus maybe when you're a native digital company in the B2C world, where pretty much, because you're born with the recurring model in mind, you don't have to think about these transitions, right? So I'm going to talk about this aspect, and keep in mind that the B2B world right now is entering fast track into the subscription world, and you could see that on a daily basis. And just yesterday, Dell Computers announced, equipment as a service. So every day there is, at least one or two players announcing the launch of their subscription. And the banking guys are paying attention, because at the end of the day, when you do a subscription, you're not doing leasing, you're not doing renting, you're doing subscription. You keep the assets in your books, and they're coming up with different financial products to be able to support B2B companies and manufacturers in the development of B2B subscription models. So, and that's what one of them is, the BNP leasing solution. We're very involved in the subscription economy. So my first nugget, I would say, if you're in the B2B world today and you produce equipment, products, and you have a DNA of product, and lots of companies still do. Mark was mentioning Michelin. Michelin, has been in the tire business for many, many decades, and they're moving as mobility as a service, but there's still, a lot of product discussions. So, you can't go from a traditional product-based model, what you have at the bottom left of this chart, straight to moving 80% of your business to product as a service. Where the customer, the subscriber, is at the center of the business model. So there's going to be a transformational set of activities that you have to go, and you have to get your mindset in your organization used to think about services and recurring businesses. And the first one is really repackaging your current solutions, offers, spare parts, whatever you're doing, as a recurring business. And that will help you with a lot of the service mindset, because when you move to subscription, you have to have a service mindset. You service the goods and the products that you are managing on behalf of the customer. The customer pays you a monthly subscription or a usage, based fee. So, it's important, to think about, yes, you could rush to product as a service, but you have to have a service mindset, a service organization, a service division. And you see that most of the bigger industrial groups like the Siemens and the Boeings and UTC, they've set up service divisions. So they have that in their DNA, including others, who are used to sell complex systems. So they're used to, combining product, service, software, and managing that for their customers. Another avenue of development is connected services. You have to, connect your products and equipment, and make sure you develop services, based on that, and you get the data. And so there is. I'm saying this because at some point that transformation will be a slow, morphing of your business model to have more of a portfolio approach, where you will have still product sales, you will have recurring sales, typically in service and spare parts and other areas, and then you would have, product as a service. So it is a transformation that is not going to be 6 months. You may have one subscription, you may have two subscription offers, but you also have to think about the other aspect of the transformation. Now, another myth out there is, and we talk a lot about subscription, and there's a tremendous amount of publication and buzz today about the subscription business model. But at the end of the day, recurring business is much more than subscription. You got to think about what Mark was obviously talking about before: usage-based, hybrid-based pricing, outcome-based pricing, designing your subscription. But then you're also talking about, moving some products into a recurring model. You could actually take a product and as is and offer it as a subscription. You have to have a great catalog. You have to have, a mindset of productization. So, you see now companies are setting up, and what I mean companies is B2B industrial manufacturing companies start to set up their targets for how much of our business do we think we can have in a recurring format. Instead of being maybe product centric, I'm selling in a CapEx model, or instead of being project centric, where I'm going to pursue projects, consulting projects or government contracts, for example. So, the management of a recurring business model includes all of this. And it's not just about, I'm going to set up 2 or 3 subscription offers and that's it. I move to recurring. There is a transformational approach to it. And you have to manage that as a portfolio, and it's going to be a portfolio of business models. So, but at some point, and I'm talking here about these industrial and manufacturing companies willing, right now they're all jumping on the bandwagon. You're talking about the Schneider, the Thales, the ABB of the world, the Michelin. They all launching their subscription. They all have a portion of their business in recurring format. But they also look at this and say, well, I think we could have a portion of maybe 10, 15, 20, 25% of our overall sales, being in the recurring model. And it maybe is a bit irrational to think that an entire organization the size of Michelin will be recurring in the next 3 years. So it's not like maybe a SaaS company or a software company that will, like Adobe, that moved pretty much everything into a subscription. So a good target is 20 to 25% for a legacy industrial company, and then designing a roadmap, to get after these 25% over time. So I recently published an essay in Industry Week, looking at, some of the mistakes. I spent a few months looking at all the subscriptions that were created by B2B companies and industrial manufacturing companies. And you see some of the traditional mistakes that companies do when they are traditionally more cost plus in their pricing strategies. Also not having the sophistication that they may, have when, you have to manage what Mark was saying before, the balance of trade-off between, the package, the model, and the price decision. And at least 10 of them, probably more than that, but typically there is, the traditional cost plus approach and pricing too low. So, and maybe, we look at too much at what the B2C companies do, and, we look at it's always going to be $10 or $9.99, and it's very cheap. And the confusion here is because in manufacturing companies, for example, or industrial groups, we do already leasing and renting. Then we think that, and we do cost plus, so there's not going to be a lot of value capture. And when I show in some of these companies that I'm privileged to talk to, when I show that sometimes when you move to subscription or recurring, you pay 2, 3, 4, 5 times the price of the acquisition model, the upfront model. People are looking at this and say, wow, that's a high price. Yeah, but that's a high price over the lifetime of the offer, but you're also providing a lot of value in the subscription, in addition to moving from CapEx to OpEx. So that mindset is, it's slow to get in. They're also not using the right value metric, and Mark touched on that already. When we looked at the Michelin model, instead of selling per tire, is selling per kilometer. You really have to understand what the customers are doing, what the jobs to be done of a customer is, like moving goods from point A to point B, and the tire is just an end to the means to the end. Sorry. So, and that lack of maybe customer centricity in the industrial world is appearing when you design subscription models. So the lack of versioning is a traditional issue in manufacturing and industrial settings because of you need to do your customer base segmentation, and from that you come up with the packages that Mark was beautifully describing, and are able to make it very simple for the customer. Now in the SaaS world, about 70 to 75% of SaaS packaging is good, better, best. It's a traditional way of offering good choices for the customer with a bit of psychology and the excellent versioning of what goes in each of the levels. And typically we don't see that much yet in B2B and industrial environments. Number 7 is a freemium side, and right now too much of that is offered in freemium instead of having maybe a cheapmium or a free trial period with which is very controlled. So lots of potential mistakes, and it's okay. I typically recommend companies that are just getting started to look at the best practices of the B2C world, the SaaS world, the service software as a service, and to learn and to read about what makes them successful, because they already made the mistakes. So, don't offer a large discount. Like Mark was saying, your price is going to evolve over time. Your packaging will evolve over time. You have to give your customers the chance of changing their subscription over time. So, a lot of that has been written, published already. So there's a lot of websites that you can go to, and obviously you could hire the expert SKP to help you, design these beautiful strategies there. So Mark touched on all of this, but I typically see, 5 areas of when you work in digital pricing strategy, you really have to pay attention to these 5. And Mark already touched about the package and the model and setting up the right pricing levels and the structure and the discounting. So I'm not going to go through 2 and 3. Other dimension that is very important is spending the right amount of money and attention on the point number 1, which is really truly understand why are you doing that subscription? What is the customer problem you're solving? Are you assessing the willingness to pay by doing the proper research techniques, whether it's expert interview, conjoint or trade-off analysis, or there's quantitative and qualitative. There's different ways of looking at the willingness to pay, because that's going to inform your pricing package eventually and your price level. So jumping to level 2.4, at some point in many companies, you already have legacy pricing structure, right? You're not a native in digital, so you have to integrate your new pricing models into the existing structure, which means a lot of integration and a lot of transitioning, from a pure maybe CapEx model with product pricing and service pricing to, you're adding the hybrid aspect, where maybe a customer may buy some product up front and they may subscribe to something else, a usage-based pricing. And that transition requires a lot of attention in the back office, which is where you need to have the proper solution, like the Sentinel, to be looking at the entitlement and usage of your software, your licenses. You need to have a subscription engine. So, I mean, there's a lot of things that we typically forget. And not forgetting that eventually, point number 5, you need to scale your opportunity and using pricing to scale for growth. So Mark was saying you could use premium pricing, or you could use penetration pricing, or hybrid. But at some point, you want to be viral in a way that you touch enough customers and you acquire enough customers, and then you retain them. Or if you price too high, then you're going to have a tough time convincing your customers to test or to try your subscription. So, so it's not just about the package, not about just the discount structure. It's looking at the 1 to 5. And typically, to do this, you need to have some kind of a framework. And I developed for Thales, and it's available online in the public space, a pricing model innovation canvas, where you typically look at the 4 C's, all the information about the customer value, the competition, and your costs, plus a little bit of change management. And that, really helps you, in the approach of designing the packaging, the modeling, the level and the structure of your subscription or your recurring business model, test your profit formula, and then execute your pricing in your organization. And teams need to have this type of structure to be able to gather all the intelligent information to make a very good framing decision for your subscription. So all of this typically is spread in many PowerPoints, in many sources of information. So really, at the end, when we do framing in Thales of a subscription offer, we fill this canvas and we put that in the I would say the go-to-market package that goes through the gate and eventually launch. But you need to pay attention to all these 4 C's to be able to make a very good decision on your pricing innovation, because it is an innovation. And if you're doing pure CapEx or ownership type pricing models today, you're going to have to think about change management a lot, in the future. And that includes some of these, 10 points that I put here, so innovating in your pricing models, it requires preparation. you're going to have to work very closely with your financial team, because now you're getting into issues of billing for the usage. So you need to have the right engine to truly understand the usage of your customers. Also, the financial implication to moving to a recurring business model and all the cash flow implications. Because, imagine now you're a $10 billion company or $2 billion company and you're moving 20% on the recurring, which means, people pay you over time. They don't pay you upfront. There's going to be some cash flow issues there. Number three is, and you get into, discussions with the sales force on, now I'm not selling products, I'm selling products or a subscription over time, which means I'm in a way cannibalizing product sales because I'm offering a different business model. So you need to look at the impact on existing contract, your distribution channels, the huge implications here as well when you move to subscription, because a subscription implies that you're dealing directly with the end user. So you have to, get your customers educated, make sure they understand the value proposition of your subscription, what they have to do as far as usage is concerned, who gets paid for what, and the behavior. So, for example, you're offering predictive maintenance in the plant. In a subscription, you got to make sure they respect the usage, model that you put in place, the speed of the machines, they use the machines the way they're supposed to use the machines, and that's very important if you do outcome-based pricing. The rest is really looking at your back office. You have to prepare the groundwork in your IT and ERP systems. You need to have the right entitlement software, communicate the business rules, train the sales force, have the commercial contract templates, because when you move to subscription, your sales conditions, general sales conditions change. So it's not the same type of contracts, because you're not transacting, you're not selling a product, you're selling a service over time. So it's different verbiage in the contracts. So you see lots of implication, and it and it's great, it's fine. Lots of companies have done that, and so if you search Google Doc, you'll see a lot of examples of contracts, a lot of examples on, how do you transition from perpetual to SaaS models in software. It's the same in the B2B and in the industrial world. You're going to have to pay attention to these 10 points right here to prepare the launch and the scaling of your subscription. So that's the size, that's my presentation. Lots to think about, lots of nuggets. Mark covered a lot of the aspects of the technical side of pricing. I think I wanted to make sure that people understand it is not just a simple fact of designing a subscription and launching it. There's going to be implication. There's going to be a transition if you want to move a lot of your business to recurring. But it's a beautiful model. It's something that's going to complement your traditional CapEx model, I would say. And it's a super opportunity for growth. So everything we do in pricing, and I think Mark will agree, is to provide top line and bottom line growth. Thank you. That ends my presentation.
Thank you, Stephan. Thank you, Mark. We'd now like to take time for some questions. So we're going to move on to some Q&A, and if you do have questions, feel free to continue to add them into the chat window. The first question is for Mark, and that is, what do you find is the most difficult step in transitioning to subscriptions in reality? We talked about a lot of things today, but what do you think is the most difficult step to transitioning?
It's a great question, and I think it touches on, there's so many things we could talk about there, right? And Stephan talked about the practical reality of subscription. If I kind of keep it sort of more, at the model stage, I think the most difficult thing for most people is accepting that as they move into a subscription world, they have to rethink that price model piece. I think most people can get on board with the packaging because they like that, but actually thinking through this whole, do I just have to now jump to 12 months all you can eat? Because most companies look at that and they model that out, and the risk just seems too great. And they look at all the issues they have in terms of, what happens if people use too much, all this stuff I talked about with who will pay me that much money. So that, I think, is the most complicated thing, is getting the the calibration of that kind of whatever it is, term-based subscription thing, right? And I would really encourage people, like I said, to think about some of the kind of the smaller steps first. Maybe saying, you know, we don't have to jump to full subscription in step one. Why not have a model whereby, hey, maybe you pay me £100 at the beginning of the year, and then you get 50% off each transaction you make? Why not say we buy a bucket of 50 transactions, and when that's run out, we can talk again about what happens next? Why not have a kind of a model that says, hey, we think we could put you on £1,000 a year, but if you use a lot more, we can move that up at the end. So I would encourage people to think about some of those more creative options, because otherwise I think the huge jump from pure transaction to full subscription can almost become too risky, I think, when you run the numbers on it.
Excellent, thank you. All really good points. The next question is for Stephan, and that is, you spoke a lot about recurring revenue being not just subscriptions. Do you have a good example of what you feel is best in class subscription models that are being used today?
Well, so yes, I would say, you know, those are two different things: recurring business model and subscription. You know, subscription is a type of pricing model, which is part of recurring. So if you look at the B2B space, you know, in the software space, you know, the stories of transitions are, you know, out there in the public. The transition of Adobe, the transition of Microsoft 365, those are examples of, you know, beautiful transitions that were difficult at the beginning, but you look at now the, you know, the results and the financial payout is phenomenal for both companies. In the pure B2B world, in the industrial world, you know, I've spent the last 3 to 6 months, you know, gathering all the examples of subscription. It is difficult to find a very successful model. I typically would go into what Caterpillar is doing with Cat Connect. I would go into what Sandvik is doing with some of the software for the machine tooling industry. You look at what Schneider Electric is doing, you know, as far as offering apps and you know, and solutions as far as in their platform. So they more have a platform, a digital platform approach, and they're offering services and apps in that platform. It's a beginning. I would say it's not perfect, but it's a beginning. And I think one of the issue that it's a bit frustrating from you know, not the B2C side, but more the B2B side. It's difficult to scale, and it's difficult to you know, to reach a lot of different customers, because they want to, you know, a lot of customers want to do pilots. They want to try it before they expand it, and so it typically is a land and expand. On the expand side, it's a bit difficult. So we're not there. There's plenty of nuggets, though. You know, plenty of companies in the subscription side. On the recurring business, there's a lot of companies that are actually do recurring business models, like the Boeings or Siemens or other companies that already have a very good base of recurring business models.
Excellent, thank you. So the next question is, can you offer any advice for handling conversion from long-term fixed price contracts to subscriptions?
So maybe I can take a first step. So from long-term fixed price contracts to subscriptions. So I mean, what's quite interesting in that, and again, I don't know the full context, but many long-term fixed price contracts already have some of that kind of recurring nature about them already, which is there's something in place that has a time period. At the end of the time period, the contract gets renegotiated. So I assume this is more the kind of the framework agreement where the fixed price contract covers, I suppose, the transaction price, but there's no real commitment to volume. So how do you start taking those to subscription? I mean, the first thing then is to understand and look at the real behavior patterns under the contract, right? And that comes to that point I talked about in terms of calibration, which is we look at the contract and we say, listen, over the year, this customer uses around about X. I think the best way to transition from that to a subscription is what I would call this kind of adaptive flat rate model that says, well, listen, last year you paid us 50K under the contract, so we're going to put you on a subscription, and the subscription says you can use a unlimited or whatever we want to say, or with certain limits around it. But really, we kind of take the cap off that and say, last year you paid us 50. We're going to move you to this unlimited plan. So we move you up to say 75K. You use as much as you like. But, you know, at the end of the year, we review that, and if you're above this level, then we move you up the step again to 100K, and above that 150K. By the way, Mr. Customer, if you use a lot less than that, we can move you back down to 50 or 40. So I think that's the way that we balance the risk, because otherwise one party or the other has to bear too much risk in that says we either need to set a very high price in the subscription because we worry you might use way more than you have done in the past, in which case the customer wouldn't buy it, or we have to make that reasonably close to what you pay today, but then we expose ourselves to kind of all this kind of usage breakage that you might incur. So I would suggest looking at something like an adaptive model based on the last year or two's data, with a little uplift for kind of the upside we expect to get when we kind of move on to more unlimited model, but with this very clear condition: after a certain period of time we review real life and we have the option to move it up or down to keep it fair for both parties.
Yeah, I'll rebound on that just to add a couple points. That's a good answer, Mark. I would say lots of companies are using the recurring business model and subscription to compete. You know, when the contract is coming for renewal, instead of reoffering a traditional long-term contract where everybody comes in and offer the same model, you could use the recurring approach to disrupt the business model and help the customer, you know, in their operational cost, I would say. You know, so that's a point, and we see that happening a lot. You know, taking a different approach to the business model with that customer and offering a brand new or a disruptive approach to the contract. The other point is that Mark touched on is to be able to do this, you really need to recreate the past and truly understand the customer usage, and to be able to model it and educate the customers on, you know, maybe based on your profile, you're better suited for a usage-based model or a subscription model, and you have to, you know, if the customer is not asking for it, you have to educate the customer, you know, and help them save either CapEx or OpEx, and you'll be seen as a true customer-centric organization. So it's not for everyone. I would say you really need to pay attention to the customer problem and base your decision to move to a subscription or a recurring business model for that customer, and based on what you hear from the customer, and then help them transition. So that's what I would add this.
Thank you both. And thank you everyone for attending again. This concludes our session for today. And be on the lookout for a link to where you can access the recording of today's session. Stephan, Mark, thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank you.